This is John Drabinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Seulghee Lee, who teaches in the Departments of English and African American Studies at University of South Carolina. In addition to a number of scholarly pieces, he is the author of OtherLovings, an AfroAsian American Theory of Life from 2025, and co-editor with Rebecca Kumar of Queer and Femme Gazes in AfroAsian American Visual Culture from 2024. In this conversation, we engage the relationship between literary and expressive culture in Black studies, comparative racial and ethnic study, and the importance of critical theoretical work in the history and future of the field. Good morning, Seulghee. How are you?
I'm well, John. Thanks so much for having me. How are you?
I'm great. I'm coming from, a hotel room in Atlanta, so keeping the podcast alive on the road and all of that. But I'm so happy we found the time. I was really excited about this chance for us to talk on the podcast. We've known each other a while. I really, really love your work. I think it's super interesting and important and really a valuable contribution to the field. I think you do things internal to Black studies, but also bring some really important new questions to the field. So, I'm really happy just as a friend and colleague that you're on the podcast, but in terms of the kinds of perspectives and information that, thoughtfulness that you can bring to the episode, and series, I'm just really grateful for your time. So thank you.
It's an honor to be here. I'm a fan, avid listener of the podcast. So it's a real privilege. And I really appreciate you personally and your support of my career. And it's been really good knowing you all these years.
Hey, great. We are off to a good start. Mutual appreciation and affection. So let me start with a question. I mean, we'll talk about your work and, how you imagine the field of Black studies and your work in relation to it. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question to begin, which is just to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What got you interested in Black studies? And for me, always a sort of companion question there, which is what keeps you connected and committed to the field?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which meant that I had a certain kind of early invitation to questions of social justice and racial justice starting in high school. And so I was curious about questions about racial inequality and injustice from growing up in that milieu as a immigrant kid from Korea. And then when I got to college, I had this kind of epiphanic moment in my freshman and sophomore years under the tutelage of one professor who sent me on my way. And in that academic setting, it was a seminar on the Black arts movement. And I got an entry into the African American culture tradition, to poetry as its own kind of relatively autonomous genre within Black letters, to jazz and specifically free jazz as a way to kind of anchor some of those literary sources. And on top of that, the historical references we were studying in that class were written by the professor himself in the Encyclopedia of African American Culture and History, which he had co-edited. And so reading back from that, I got immersed into the, fantasy and the desire for a project of the Encyclopedia Africana, in cognate iterations from Du Bois and Whitson. And so I was just so inspired and deeply immersed in questions of Black study and Black life and Black cultural traditions from a really early stage in my undergraduate education. And that piggybacked into the Mellon Mays Fellowship, and I got kind of an early inkling of what it means to do academic life and fusing it with the life of the mind that had been modeled for me by David Smith. And so I got kind of sent on my way. And then also just kind of existentially, I would say I'm one of, the countless Asian Americans who found a lot of who we are and what we have been through Black history and being inspired by Black studies, all the way back to Ron Takaki, but you could also include outside the academic realm, Grace and Yuri. And so I would say those are the three main trajectories that kind of explain my my place here.
So I'm interested also to hear a little bit about, you say, the growing up in Chapel Hill and, as a, I think you said children of immigrants from Korea and the Black experience there. And then it's interesting because that suggests a sort of, sort of political and economic marginalization, persecution, and et cetera. And then it's the Black arts movement. I'm sort of in poetry and music. And so I actually wanted to just kind of follow up and say, like, how did you see the resonance between those two things? I mean, I know the Black arts movement and free jazz movement was understood itself to be deeply political, but it's one thing for a poet to say, hey, I'm a revolutionary. I mean, everybody's a revolutionary, right, in those moments. But I'm actually interested in like how those two formative sort of moments that you talked about, how that college experience, how that classroom experience like spoke to the Chapel Hill experience.
Yeah, it's a really cool question. I mean, I guess I would say I reflect on that tension, throughout my life and throughout my professional activities. It's very much ensconced in my activity as a Black Studies professor here in South Carolina now. And I've always felt a certain kind of, we'll get to this later in terms of the state of the field and what the field can do and how it envisions itself. But that kind of cleavage, right, that maybe functional impasse between Black thought and everyday Black life was really present for me from jump. And so I've always kind of, been thinking about those questions of inequity and inequality and just, the afterlife of, all of our systems. And so that actually has, I guess at that stage of my intellectual development, the anger, the righteousness, the indignation, but also the passion and the compassion and the fortitude, exhibited by Baraka and his milieu, his cohort, to my mind, really was addressing those material conditions. And I guess, thinking about what it is that the life of the mind can offer those conditions, right? That those figures, it could be Du Bois, it could be Cedric Robinson, a variety of thinkers that really inspired me early on. They're first and foremost, ringing that bell of desperation of what it means to come from a people that have been so subjugated, and everything they write, everything they talk about is coming out of that sense of desperation. And again, that, really kind of messed me up in a profound way.
There's something really interesting. I mean, I'm always interested in those moments and, goes to sort of the next question. But before we get to that, just wanted to say, like, that question of, as you said, the sort of relationship between like Black studies and everyday Black life or Black people and the way we make those bridges, I think the default is really to think about, how does it translate into certain kinds of mobilization or a kind of mirroring or something. But it's interesting the way you put that is that it was that bridge is really affect, right? And affect is so productive because it's not just a feeling. It actually informs, as you say, like, politics, but also structures of friendship and community and comradeship and everything. So, so that for me, you really articulated like really concretely. There's something I find so interesting, which is affective life as that coincidence. It's not even a bridge. It's the coincidence. How did that carry over into graduate school? I mean, I know that, we were talking about it before we hit record, but, you have a mentor and we share adoration of Abdul John Muhammad. I want to make sure to get his name on the podcast.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious how this sort of, all of these things carried over into graduate study in an English department.
Well, I knew I wanted to specialize in critical theory coming from undergrad. One of the things, before we get to Abdul, I'll speak a little bit more about my undergrad mentor. DL, he had not only taught me the Black arts movement, but by the end of college, he'd also taught me Walter Benjamin, Raymond Williams, Theodore Adorno. And so I had been really curious about the intersection of Western Marxism, critical theoretical traditions with Black study. And Berkeley was the place to go pursue that. And Abdul was also, he's also an embodiment of all those intersections. And Deathbound Subject, his, magnum opus on Richard Wright, had just come out. And I was really curious about how to think about this kind of highly theoretical structure of anti-Blackness and Black life and Black death. And so it was a really great setting to kind of explore and to build my literary theoretical acumen in that context. And it was it had already emerged, but it was prior to Afro-pessimism having become even more of a bulwark of thought that emanated in English departments and Black Studies departments at that point. So I think I started that process of reading and working through some of those texts at really the right time. And so I feel very fortunate to have been at Berkeley in those years.
So, that gets you to, you've already sort of talked about this next question a bit, but in terms of the content and sort of substance. But I want to ask the question about how you imagine the field of Black Studies. We'll talk a little bit more about how some moving from English to Black Studies. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm interested just how the field of Black Studies functions in your imagination. Like, what is that portrait for you? And I wanted to ask it in really the context of its founding, which had that tension at its origin, right? Beginning with student activists who demanded a place to study Black life, right? History, literature, art, sociology, etc. And that Black Studies, the establishment of Black Studies, was going to be a place where Black life and the Black intellectual tradition had a ground, right? To be explored, to be developed, to be furthered, and so forth. But of course, that was also at a time in the late 1960s when Black liberation struggle had radicalized and really broken a lot of these boundaries between, study and action, between classroom and community, between thought and politics. Mm-hmm. And so there was also that demand of Black Studies to have an intensely political orientation and intervention at its heart. So that relationship between this sort of prescriptive demand for a politics and the sort of descriptive life of the mind, I think that tension, I just call it a tension, has really been with the field and sticks with us in 2025 as well. Yeah. And so I always want to ask people as part of this series, how do you think about Black Studies? What's that portrait for you? But also, what is that portrait in relation to this sort of founding tension?
Sure. I toggle between at least three congruent and concurrent definitions of what Black Studies ought to be. So, Cedric Robinson saying Black Studies is the critique of Western civilization. And then to your citation of the descriptive and prescriptive, Manning Marable said that thing in Black Studies and the Racial Mountain about Black Studies ought to aspire to the transformative model or the transformationist model. And then Cornel West in the early 90s had talked about, he wasn't talking about Black Studies as a field, but he was talking about the task of the Black scholar. But you'll see that, it fits this question that Black Studies ought to aspire to be, quote, de-disciplinizing modes of knowledge, right? The idea that we can aspire to undo our disciplines and deconstruct the order of knowledge that we've been given. But ultimately, especially working here in the Deep South and having done so for the last 8 years, I'm with Jared Ball. I think Black Studies ought to be conceived of as just the intellectual arm or wing of Black liberation struggle. And that's what we should be aspiring to, especially in this moment.
Yeah, especially in this moment and all moments, but the especially is such an important word in all kinds of places. And I'm glad you referenced Jared, earlier in the podcast. Mm-hmm. I always want to make sure I point people out intra-podcast. Fantastic conversation. And I was struck by that phrasing too, by the way, just personally, the intellectual arm of Black liberation struggle is the idea of the arm is so important because, again, thinking about, as I was saying before, what are these bridges between community activism, political struggle and classroom study conversation, right? There's affect that sort of permeates all of those, that is same in kind, but also every struggle has arms.
Yeah.
And that's part of the same body. Like, that's what an arm is. It's on part of the same body.
Well, it's interesting because in part, in terms of the history that I'm telling, and this could actually be a way to talk about my transition from English department to African American Studies department, but I had not been taught from David Smith that the Black arts movement was the cultural arm or wing of Black power. I didn't come to that kind of sociological conclusion until much later. And so I had always thought of this kind of relatively autonomous cultural field as this kind of intramural universe unto itself. And then, like you're saying, thinking about, especially in the affective modes, the attachment to the on-the-ground politics and liberation struggles that are ongoing, and that they're kind of indelibly, enmeshed with each other.
Yeah, let me ask you then. I mean, it is interesting to me in this series just to hear the way people come to Black studies. There's some people who, they went to junior college, got an associate's in African American studies, BA, master's, PhD, all in Black studies. And then there are other people who come to Black studies through disciplines. And so as you were saying, your graduate work was in an English department. That's a disciplinary education. And you are also in an English department now, but you're also in African American studies. And I've said, it's really how you identify yourself as a scholar and thinker. So I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about how that movement from disciplinary training to multi, whatever you want to put it, disciplinary, like non-disciplinary work, how that's informed a couple of things. One, like how you conceive a research project, right? What is research? What are the kind of claims you want to make, kind of writing you want to do? But also, if you have thoughts on it, I'm always interested in, classroom, like how that movement from a discipline to an area of study changes the way you think about pedagogy.
Yeah. It's a big thing here in particular. And because I do have my teaching in African American studies, I had to learn how to communicate ideas outside of my specializations in literary theory. And at the same time, while continuing my research and my work and my writing in those discourses. And so it's felt like it's all happening and it's the same intellectual activity. But I think if you examined the teaching and then the research, it feels a little bit more bifurcated now, at least from where I see it when I reflect back on my professional development here. And so in terms of research questions, I would say I've always been interested in those kind of mega theorizations of anti-Blackness, of racialization, and of white supremacy from various camps, but they have been relatively compatible, in my experience, with the work that's being done in English departments, in part because of the kind of previous genealogies of critical theory that emerged and that were housed in English departments in the United States. And so I haven't felt too much of a kind of struggle or friction between these modes of thinking and professional operation on my end.
Yes, this is a question for people who did doctoral work in disciplines and come to Black studies. Is always really interesting to me to think about how different disciplines make this question sound so different. And I'm in Africana studies, and I'm 51% and I'm 49%. I love state institution bureaucracies. 49% in an English department. But the thing that I will always say is that English is, at this point, even calling it a discipline is difficult.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I think, my PhD is in philosophy. That's a discipline.
Right.
Right. I think a lot of history departments are disciplines. I think even a lot of English departments are really hard disciplines. But as you said, the history since the 80s of critical theory in English departments is, as my philosophy PhD, I've struggled over the years with how to talk about, complet theory.
Yeah.
Is that is that philosophy or philosophy light? And always wanted to be a snob, but then I looked at my philosophers and I was like, I don't want to be on this team. But at the same time, I mean, it says something about the way English as a discipline has opened itself up to be so multidisciplinary that it's the transition from English to Black studies is often less dramatic than, say, anthropology or something like that, I think.
I mean, I guess one thing I would add to that is the idea of doing Afro-Asian comparisons specifically, and I'm talking about Black and Asian American racialization in the same breath. I think that is a harder or more difficult hurdle within both disciplines. And
Interesting.
there's, obviously a lot of groundbreaking work, and there's numerous scholars working on similar questions to mine in both English departments and Black Studies departments. But I feel like our sense of legibility and of interpretive community and of just kind of philosophical coherence, I feel like that's been kind of more like beyond my grasp in over these years, especially in getting these texts done.
Yeah, so let me pick up on that and ask you to talk about that a little bit more. I mean, your work is, you work in sort of cultural and literary sensibilities, critical theory, work on race and gender, comparative work, and I just think there's so many insights for Black studies in the kind of work that you do, not just, specifically in the actual work that you do, but also just in your approach and your mixture of questions and sources and all of that. And so, I wanted to ask you, though, to reflect on your work in relation to the field of Black studies in terms of its history. Like, where do you see that work fitting into the tradition, right? Where does it have a sort of root in the tradition, if it does? And also, what horizons do you see it opening up? What boundaries do you see it pushing to make Black studies move in somewhat of a different direction?
Sure.
Or a new direction?
I guess one thing I would say is, in this way, I'm very much philosophy light, but I'm trying to contribute to what I kind of periodize in my single author text that came out this year as the ontological turn in Black studies. The configuration of 25 thinkers. I would include you in that matrix of figures who have turned questions of the historical and of the cultural into questions of reality principles and almost like a trans-historical view of anti-Black violence and gratuitous violence, but also the possibilities of Black life. And so OtherLovings is trying to contribute to that discourse, and is doing so by rebutting the kinds of, again, like the romance of negativity that some vectors of this ontological turn have offered and have kind of proffered as the kind of ultimate truth of the reality of anti-Blackness. And I'm making a offering that the love that coheres Black life and Asian American life kind of speaks back to that in a direct way. I would say that my work in Black studies also is trying to revivify and contribute to the relatively small field of Afro-Asian studies, and to try to revive the traditions that go back to a fully liberatory, philosophical discourse that, culminates in the late 60s, but also, has its roots in the Bandung Conference in 55, and thinking about people of color consciousness, global solidarity questions in this era. And so I've always been interested in those kinds of cross-racial possibilities for transformation.
Yeah. So and I do also just want to clarify the philosophy light. I consider myself completely a philosophy light person for a couple of decades now. So, because philosophy heavy, it's like having like heavy cream in your coffee or something. It's just a little too much, takes away from the flavor of the thing that you want to engage. But but to ask you maybe a little bit more about that. I mean, you said two things that I found really interesting, and I wanted to hear you talk about the relationship between them. One was this notion of love and coherence of life, right, as a big theoretical question, but also the Asian and African American or Black comparative space, right, and what that generates. And so I'm interested how you both see those things working together in the field of Black studies, but also which, is it something about the comparative work that says something about this notion of love and coherence of life, which goes very far back in the Black intellectual tradition, but as you said, also is like, puts a complicating kind of factor into a sort of pessimist turn, nihilist turn of the last couple decades, at least in critical theory. But I'm interested in, how the comparative work, is that sort of where you generated some of these notions, or is it that this notion of like love, coherence, life sort of helped make sense of comparative study, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes. I'm still wondering that. I think it's. I would say I would frame it more as the latter. I would say that the presence of the recognition of love, the rejection of intersubjectivity, and the rejection of the kind of Foucauldian model of subjectivity subjection that we see across both literary canons speaks to and begs a kind of systematic comparison. But I would also say that it's probably a symptom of a larger academic thing, that the two most compelling and probably most significant theoretical idioms that have emerged from both Asian American studies and Black studies during my education, early 21st century, were Afro-pessimism and racial melancholia. And when you put them side by side, they have some really striking similarities, and that's what I try to schematize in the book. And so it's even on the basis of a kind of, again, just a critical theory light kind of argumentation, they beg comparison. And so it's interesting that Black life has been analyzed as solely natal alienation and Black death and pessimism, as you said, and then Asian American discourse has been solely under the education that I received, been perceived as total lack and absence and a kind of lost love. And that notion of lost love was, when I first read it, was particularly kind of jarring to me, because it just doesn't sit right with any of the literatures I was reading, but it also doesn't sit right with how I understand where I come from and my communities and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, this may be more speculative, but what do you think is some of the political sort of consequences? Because, questions of political solidarity, existential solidarity, literary solidarity, theoretical solidarity, this sort of, all these things both intermix, and these different kinds of solidarities or similarities or whatever you want to call it, intersections, they connect, but they also, it's at that moment of politics that I think is so interesting. Like, I'm interested if you think, given, you talked about, Grace Lee Boggs and a few other people in terms of like political solidarity, and political radicalism that brought this sort of radical Asian American, radical African American political intervention together. Do you think this kind of work that you're doing actually resonates in a kind of different aspect of that political work as well, or possible political work?
Yeah, I hope it does. I aspire to that. One thing I've been thinking about is that it's already been a decade and more since Grace and Yuri have passed on. And so what it means to...
Wow, a decade? That's wild.
Yeah. When I was in graduate school, Yuri Kochiyama was an Oakland resident, right? She was still out there. And so having lost those titans, it begs the question of what it means to think about Asian American politics through that lens of kind of people of color radicalism, or through pro-Blackness, or however you want to call it. And so I'm a little bit at a loss for how that's going to continue now, and I'm hoping to try to continue that. And I think that, without trying to sound like too harsh against the critical discourses I just mentioned, I feel like both of those theoretical encampments have had their own kind of outsized roles to play, especially within academia, but also in public discourse and public culture, about how we conceive of ourselves. And one of the consequences from that, I see it every day in social media discourse, especially from the younger generations, is the idea that we don't have anything to do with each other. and that, Black suffering and anti-Black violence are their own lanes, and that they need to be considered as such, and that the possibilities for any kind of reaching out for the other, especially under similar or relatively comparative conditions, it seems to be lost in the mix. And I would say the same thing with the kind of scandalous notion that Asian Americans are kind of generically and generalizably white adjacent, or we all aspire to that. And I feel like that is not only offensive to the majority of Asian Americans in this country, but also the idea that that kind of psychic and sociological configuration is kind of our lot. And I'm trying to speak back to that as well.
And in this moment, whether it's campus politics, faculty, department politics, or any aspect of national material politics, living in this moment under a far right regime, and I say it in different, contexts across this podcast. I mean, we just can't afford to not have friends, right? We can't afford to be on islands by ourselves. I mean, I think about that as the field of Black studies, this topic of the podcast and where we both work. But I'm like, when we're under attack, I think this is a real important question to ask as departments. Who are our friends?
Yeah.
If they tried to close us down, is there anybody who would refuse to teach on our behalf?
Yeah.
Right? Is there anybody who would resist? And if the answer is I don't know or no, that's terrifying. And we ought to think really hard about that. And I think that, this very insular kind of academic setting can be generalized, like as, the way you were talking about, it's like, how we understand ourselves. I like the way you put that. I mean, it's like the political and the existential aren't, they're not living separate lives, they deeply inform each other. So how we understand ourselves, and then the political possibilities, both as one community, but also in relation to other communities, I think is always an important question. I don't think that's ever not been an important question. But boy, in a time of a far right government and fascist regime, it's what does it mean to take a pause on friendships and collaborations and solidarities? Because we need, I don't know how else to put it, we need all hands on deck.
Yeah,
to put it lightly.
I would also say that the previous crisis that feels like it was a very long time ago now, but summer 2020 invited this real opportunity politically to talk about Afro-Asian collaboration and solidarity, because that iteration of the movement for Black lives coincided with all of this gratuitous violence, random street violence against Asian Americans that was like really thoroughly documented, but people didn't have much of an idiom for how to discuss it. And our sector and our industry had very little to say about those possibilities. And so that caused a lot of anguish and agony on my end, but it also, I was trying to kind of map it as much as I could. So it informs my writings in this text and in some other stuff as well.
No, I love that. I'm glad that bringing up 2020. I mean, it's only 5 years ago. It does seem like a lifetime ago, but you're right. I mean, that was a moment, and a reckoning with that. Yeah, I think like rethinking summer 2020 is a great theme for a conference, a book collection of essays, anything. Because, missed opportunity. I mean, it's kind of a boring phrase, but it is really was a missed opportunity. Talking about our field, I can't think of anyone who took that really seriously, even though I think that that's part of what academics are good at, which is to give a vocabulary to something when we don't quite have it. Right. Stop Asian hate being the only phrase that I can actually pull from that moment is actually a problem, right? In part because it's a problem, but also because that's where we work in words.
Yeah.
That's our contribution. So something to reckon with for sure. Maybe it's a good transition to one of the sort of last two questions I have for you, which is thinking about the field of Black studies over the last 5.5 decades. What do you think that the field of Black studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
There's a couple of items. I know that there's a recalibration within the field, especially within our sector of the field, to say that it was already a kind of compromise or accommodation for Black studies to become institutionalized when it did, that it was a way to kind of funnel the revolutionary energies coming out of 68. I'm not fully comfortable with that recalibration because I think it kind of looks away from the sacrifices and from the commitments of the actual students who fought for those things and kind of engendered effective investments, but also real political energies toward this institutionalization. So against that backdrop, I would say that the field has done relatively well in surviving and kind of leaving institutional footprints. But by virtue of that, and especially under neoliberalization, right, under the last 50, 55 years, my department, for example, just received department status 3 years ago. And my affect regarding that is obviously pride, right? I'm proud to have been part of those discussions and to be working in an autonomous department of African American Studies now, and to be the first person to be tenured by that department. And so I take the kind of professional and academic trajectories that all of that took very seriously. And so that survival is important. But what it hasn't done well, by virtue of that work and of that survival instinct, is that it has never reconciled its alienation from everyday Black people, and it's never lived up to its mission of offering real material intellectual weaponry for Black communities by and large. And so that's one thing. I would say that within the theoretical vectors of Black studies, there's been so much amazing work that rebuts Western critical traditions. But from where I'm sitting, again, AfroAsian studies, comparative race studies are still relatively small. And so another thing that it hasn't done particularly well, while being really good at articulating anti-Blackness and a history of what Black people have gone through a variety of idioms, it hasn't, from where I'm sitting, foregrounded people of color consciousness and solidarity as much as it should. And especially, as you said, especially in this moment.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. And yeah, I have to say, I did not know that about your department. And in terms of departmental status, and there's something really interesting to me, and obviously I don't have like the information at my fingertips, but thinking about departments of Black studies, or whatever variant of the name, recent department status stories and where those are located. I'm just thinking, your University of South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina, there is no more important state in the history of African American life and history. There's just no more important state. And so there's something revealing and terrifying and bad, but also beautiful about departmentalization, right? The beautiful thing is that, in South Carolina, to have a Department of African American Studies has a transhistorical significance that I think really has to be said out loud, but also it only being, a recent phenomenon says a lot about a lot of things, because of the significance of all of that. And I think the survival of Black studies through all of this is such a complicated story. And I just want to say, I really love the way you put that about, when we talk about compromises and so forth that come with being institutionalized, how to balance that sort of critical discourse with, as you put it, the risks that students took. I think about that all the time. There's like 19, 20-year-olds standing up to their professors and to administrators. And, I said in a recent podcast, I forget who it was with, but I was like, on the one hand, that's part of what's beautiful about 18 to 22-year-olds is they just have an audacity that's out of control. I mean, it could be obnoxious as a professor. You're like, come on, take it down a notch. But it gives them the courage in these moments. But I think it's really important to just say like what courage that was and what a commitment they had to change history. I think that changed how higher ed works, and balancing those two things. I I struggle with that myself. So I was just glad that all that's to say, I was really glad you put a name to that. Yeah.
I also think that, I know you've had such a heterogeneity of guests, so, working in other iterations of Black studies, as you said. And I think that at least from, I'm very grateful to be in South Carolina and to be ensconced for the historical reasons you just cited. But one thing that's missing from my professional life is the idea of a kind of congruence between the different sections of ethnic studies. And so if you think about the San Francisco state protests, right, they were fighting for Black studies simultaneous with, right, the demands for other ethnic studies programs. And so, again, that kind of, to give a little context to my lament about people of color consciousness, it really depends on where you are in the country and what you've inherited in this historical moment and, what you're attuned to. But within Black studies as its own intramural field, I would say that that's still relatively lacking.
Yeah, and just again, an intro podcast reference, the conversation I had with Gervette Ward at City College in New York and Harlem. I mean, there's something really important about that history because it was a founding, and I don't know, but I would guess it's the only department that had this name. It was the Department of Black, Puerto Rican, and Jewish Studies.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so when you talk about sort of ethnic studies and Black studies, that's like and it was important, of course, because Black and Puerto Rican students shut down the campus, right? And then there's like an interesting history about how Jewish studies gets in there, but that sense of ethnic studies and Black studies, it's hard because everybody wants to remain a department and no one wants to get absorbed. And there's that moment where you think like, well, if we start to articulate these relations, is some administrator going to be like, oh, let's cut down these programs.
Right.
But also the difficult stories that are told between different historical experiences and intellectual traditions. But hopefully that's, I think your work is a huge step, with other people as well, but it's just a huge step down that path of taking it really seriously and not just having like platitudes about these relationships, but actually getting into sources, getting into critical theory and so forth. I think critical theory is like such an interesting space for that stuff to happen because it helps us see everyday life, cultural objects, cultural events, political events differently, see different aspects. So you do a great job with that, I have to say.
I'll just cite this one other thing. I heard Robin Kelly say about 5 or 8 years ago that he prefers the moniker liberation studies, and that's always stuck with me. So whenever I get to this impasse in the conversation about what to name it, and ethnic studies, Asian American studies, and so on, I remember liberation studies as the label.
We've been trying to find time to get Robin on the podcast. So if you listen, Robin, just email me or Ashley. We got to get this term. I love that. That's fantastic. Yeah. I haven't heard that. That's great. Let me ask then a last question, sort of wrap up, which is in a sort of Black studies, comparative studies context. What is the question you would want us to all ask? What is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
The number one thing for me pedagogically is opening students' minds to the idea that their experiences obviously are valid and coherent, and that any affective investments therefrom, including political indignation and outrage, are well warranted. We need to keep that spirit alive, that kind of contestatory resistance spirit. One thing I've noticed about especially public-facing iterations of Black studies is that a lot of us, especially in my generation and younger, have started to think that resistance is like an insufficient term, or that they want to move beyond it. And so I'm kind of monitoring that, and I'm curious about that. So I guess what I would say is what it means for our students to be plugged into a liberatory struggle that implicates them and their ancestors and also looks outward. I'm surprised by how many students come through my classes that have never had the thought that even such a thing as Black liberation struggle has anything to do with what's going on in the ice raids or what's going on in Gaza and so on. And so making those connections very clear intellectually, and then also modeling what it means to be politically invested in such questions, I feel like that's what we ought to be doing.
I love that. That's a wonderful place to wrap up. I mean, the consequences of getting that inside of a student are just so much further reaching than I think we ever really imagine and ever really see. And it's so urgent because, they have to know that that what they're studying is not just their own personal journey, but illuminating of the world. And I love that. So hopefully everybody takes that with them. There's so much in this conversation, Seulghee. I'm so glad that we've found the time. I was really excited to talk, and this has just been exceeded what I had hoped for in the episode. So thank you for your time, and thank you for such seriousness and thoughtfulness across this conversation.
I really appreciate your having me, and I'm really looking forward to your trilogy of texts coming out this season.
Oh, I know I'm a little embarrassed by it, but hopefully something in there will be interesting to you and others. But well, have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.